Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maya Ghosh, and I'm one of your Ath Fellows for the year. At over 400 million people, millennials make up over a third of India's population. This group of people is extremely diverse, with significant economic, linguistic, religious, cultural, and social variation. Our speaker this evening, Vivan Marwaha, class of 2017, is here to answer big picture questions about the aspirations and desires of Indian millennials, as their choices will not only determine local, regional, and the national trajectory of India, but also cast pivotal consequences on global economics. He is the author of What Millennials Want, which documents the aspirations and anxieties of these people scattered across 30,000 kilometers in 13 Indian states. Combining an expansive data set along with personal anecdotes, he narrates an intimate biography of India's millennials, investigating their attitudes towards sex, marriage, employment, religion, and politics. As a 2017 graduate of Claremont McKenna College, he is a user researcher who works on technology projects in emerging markets. As a millennial himself, he cares deeply about understanding India and its future through the youth. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. We ask that you wear your mask for the duration of the program indoors. We ask that you take a moment right now to just put away your cell phones, clear your mind, be present in this space. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Vivan to the Athenaeum.
Thank you so much. Wow, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Maya, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. This talk has been many months, many years in the making. So my book, What Millennials Want, it was supposed to come out in 2020. But we all sort of know what happened then, and after many iterations, first I was going to come, then I was going to be in conversation with a friend on Indian and Chinese millennials, and now it's just me again. It's really nice to be back here. So a huge shout out to Priya for making this happen, and for, some friendly faces in the audience, Melissa Martinez, Professor Sinha, Professor Jones, Adele, and so Shesha and so many others for being here tonight. I never thought I'd be up here, particularly 5 years after graduation. While I was at Claremont, I studied IR, and I was practically at the Ath at least once a week. I was attending talks by people from all types of ideologies, backgrounds, and lines of work. And the open nature of the dialogues that we had over here were really, it was one of the things I cherished the most of my time at Claremont. I still remember my first Ath talk. I was at the head table with Nate Silver, and he was being Nate Silver. He was talking about data, probability, statistical modeling, and separating the noise from the facts. And that last bit, separating the noise from the facts, is what really stuck with me and ultimately brought me here today. Well, that was actually my second Ath talk, because my first one, it was the freshman class talk. And someone had gone ahead and edited our speaker's Wikipedia page bio ahead of time to add some false and unflattering information about his life. So I really hope no one has done that for me tonight. But I also don't think I have a Wikipedia page, so that's a nice small mercy. Now, why am I here today? I'm here to talk about some of my insights and a little bit about my journey, about some of the insights I gathered while talking to the world's single largest group of people, India's millennials. And when I began thinking about what I wanted to say here tonight, I had many different directions in my head where I would take this talk. I also know that some of you are here out of choice, while others are here for a class requirement. Either way, I hope you go away learning something new, and if you don't, please interrogate me in the question and answer session. Now, I also know I'm in front of a bit of a hostile audience. That you guys, Gen Z, consider me and my generation old. As a 26-year-old, that's a little bit of a humbling feeling. But as my 17-year-old cousin likes to remind me all the time, I'm basically a boomer. Now, it wasn't always like this. There was a time when millennials were obsessed over. When I started thinking about my book in 2017, I just graduated college here at Claremont, and I was back at home in Delhi for the first summer in many years. Back then in the United States, everyone was obsessed with millennials. Barack Obama had won 2 elections with considerable support from first-time voters. Politicians, corporations, and everyone in between was trying to understand how do we get millennials to vote for us, work for us, buy our products, and buy our homes. I don't know if you guys, if these pictures resonate with you guys. They're fairly self-explanatory. The first one is of course, avocado toast. And the second one I'll get to in a second. But when I was in India, and I was talking, I was asking people questions about millennials, we were talking about things like avocado toast. And people were sending me this video of Simon Sinek, which is a YouTube video that went viral, where he's basically talking about how millennials are this weird, entitled generation that can't keep a job and is all about activism. And people thought that these stereotypes represented Indian millennials. We were using the same stereotypes in India, a completely different country, culture, and context. Now, as I said, I was an IR major at college. I was about to get back to DC to work at a think tank. And it was an interesting job, but at the time, I thought I'd have much greater impact in India. And I really wanted to understand what was happening in the world's second most populated country. So what did I do? Like a good IR major, I started working at a think tank in Delhi. And it was an extremely prestigious and interesting job. I got to rub shoulders with some influential people. The gentleman with me over here, he's a member of India's parliament. He's in the opposition. He's quite widely recognized, and he also has about 8-9 million Twitter followers. I talk about Twitter a lot because it's really important in my line of work. I met with Canadian prime ministers, all 4 commanders of the Quad, and even BBC primetime anchors. I was working with some of India's most interesting and impactful legislation, a data protection bill that was making its way through the country's parliament. The internet lobbies had their views, the privacy activists had their concerns, and the politicians had their own interests. At one roundtable at a fancy hotel, I realized I was the youngest person in the room, perhaps by 20 years. Just my presence at that roundtable brought the average age in that room down by a few years. That was a problem. I saw that while we were talking about India's future, we were completely missing the elephant in the room, the people who will power that future. What are their aspirations and anxieties? Do they have the jobs that India needs to become a rich country? Consider some of these numbers. India has a median age of 28. In a country of 1.3 billion people, that means more than 700 million people are under the age, 28 or younger. It has the world's largest working age population, and its millennials, or those born between 1981 and 1996, are almost 450 million. That's more than the entire population of the United States and Canada combined. As I started doing my research on this generation, I realized I had lots of questions, but very few answers available. Internet searches didn't give me much information outside of a Deloitte or McKinsey analysis, written by someone in the US using data that wasn't even Indian. But the choices and trajectory of this group of people were far too important for me to ignore. And the choices and trajectory of this group of people will impact global politics, economics, and the upcoming decades of the 21st century in more ways than we know. So this really was a pivotal time in India, 2017, 2018. Prime Minister Modi was preparing for his re-election, and foreign companies like Walmart, Amazon, and Google were investing billions of dollars in the Indian market to acquire new customers and users. And Indian tech companies began expanding massively. The gig economy and the tech economy began to take off as nearly 600 million Indians became smartphone users, many of them for the first time. They were accessing and consuming media. They were creating their own social media accounts and becoming a part of the global ecosystem. a really important churn was taking place across the country, from its villages, small towns, to its big cities. And I wanted to be there. I wanted to be in the heat of this churn, in the heat of this movement, and really understand what was going on. So I had some options in front of me. I could try to dig deeper, which would require me to quit my job, or I could continue and stay working at that think tank. I made the huge and very significant decision and scary decision to quit, and I spent the next 18 months essentially camped out and traveling in small town India. In these cities, when we say small cities or small towns, we're actually talking about any city under the population of 5 million. So that's really big by standards in the US, but in India these are not super big because they're also very spread out. I was in many ways stalking public squares, coaching centers, and places of activity, essentially any place where I could find young people willing to talk to me. Some of these conversations were short. I met someone and they spoke to me for 5 minutes on their way somewhere. Others were longer. I met someone for half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours. They took me back to their homes. They introduced me to their families, and with some people I even stayed the night. I spent a lot of time on political campaigns. In this picture over here, this was a state assembly election in 2018 in the state of Madhya Pradesh, a largely agrarian state. I was at a campaign rally, and I was just walking around, and I encountered a campaign rally. This is the candidate, the gentleman in the turban, in the headgear over here. I told him I'm this writer, working on a book on young Indians, and he thought I was writing about him, so he gave me a big hug, and he was like, you better say nice things about me. And so I just spent the day following this gentleman, and coincidentally, his rival candidate from the opposition party, the Congress, found out that there is this writer in town, and they invited me to their campaign rally. Except, for some reason, I thought I'd be in the audience, but much to my surprise, they called me up on stage. And so this photo is taken from the stage, and that's the view of the crowd from the stage. To make things even weirder, they asked me to speak. I had no idea what I was going to say. I had no business being up there. I had no business talking to anyone from this podium. So I didn't say anything. I made a quick exit. But these were some of the interviews and some of the places I went to while researching my book. So as I was doing this work, I was sharing my insights and the things I was finding with practically anyone who listened to me. I was tweeting them out, I was blogging them, and writing op-eds for Indian and international publications. Along the way, I developed a network of entrepreneurs, journalists, policymakers, and politicians that were eager to know about the things I was seeing. They constantly reminded me about the power and the importance of the work I was doing. So I'm really excited for this talk because I'm going to dive into the insights of what I found, what surprised me, and what I think some of the key issues that not just Indians, but people across the world ought to know about. The first one, India's education system. Some of you may have heard this stereotype that Indians are really good at math or engineering. Or you may have read that the CEOs of Google, Microsoft, MasterCard, and before recently, Pepsi are all Indians. And of course, some of this is true. But what I discovered was a somewhat different and more disturbing reality, that the country's education system is somewhat setting up its kids for failure. And I'm going to share a story. The photo of the story is up here, which is symbolic of India's education system. So the first trip I undertook for my field work was to the state of Bihar, which is a primarily rural and agrarian state. 20 years ago, the people of Bihar elected a very revolutionary leader, a technocrat, who promised to bring reforms. One of the first things he did was to provide schoolgirls with bicycles with which they could bike to school and to boost up literacy rates, female literacy rates, in a state which had one of India's lowest. But providing girls bicycles was much easier than actually fixing the schools. Now, if you look at this picture, it says computer, and it says say whether the following statements are true or false. Computer can do calculations. Computer stores information. The word computer is derived from the French word compute. And number 4, computer is just like a calculator. So you can see 1 and 4 are quite similar. What I didn't realize initially is that this is the only information and education that those kids were getting about computers. There was no computer in this classroom. There was no electricity connection in this classroom. Even the school where I had gone to, it was actually for kids grades 1 through 9, but there were only 3 classrooms. The other kids were being taught out in the corridor. As the students pondered these statements and said what's true or false, if you look closely at the picture, you can see the teacher. She's having henna applied on herself by one of her students. She had a wedding to attend later in the day, and she decided that, well, she needed her henna, so why not get a student to do it? Now, this is all too common. It is common for many teachers to not appear to work. And when they do appear, they're often not teaching, or they're taking care of their own personal business. Now, you might be wondering, why is Vivan talking about school kids? Millennials are much older. His book is on millennials. And it's because many of these problems begin at school. Now, what does this mean for India's students? In a survey of more than 30,000 14 to 18-year-olds in 28 districts across 24 states in India, a research team found that almost 25% of respondents failed to read basic text fluently in their native language. Think about that for a second. A quarter of those enrolled in school aged 14 to 18 cannot read their own language at a basic level. And more than half of those 14 to 18-year-olds struggled with basic division. Perhaps even more concerning about the report's findings was that the proportion of the youth who have not acquired basic math skills at age 14 is the same as those who are aged 18. What that means is that 4 additional years of secondary schooling does not create any additional learning or academic development among these students. Now, as I said, I know millennials are not in school right now, but this education they received has profound effects on everything else in their lives. It determines their earnings and their future earnings, their livelihoods, and even their marriages. India currently spends roughly 4% of its GDP on education, which is a very small sum for a developing country. Out of that, more than half of the central government's entire budget for higher education went to educate just 3% of the country's students at IITs, IIMs, NITs, and IIITs. Now, you guys don't need to know these acronyms, but they are the institutions that many of the CEOs I talked about earlier came from. These funding challenges and misplaced priorities only mean that the problems continue as kids get older. A 2019 report by the employment assessment firm Aspiring Minds found that 80% of engineers are not employable for any job in the knowledge economy, and a whopping 95% of engineering graduates cannot even code. Only 2.5% possess the required skills in AI that the industry requires. So now, to solve some of these problems, a huge coaching industry has mushroomed in India and taken off in the last 20-30 years. I went to many small towns and cities where the coaching industry was the only hub of economic activity that was taking place. One of those is in my book. It's a city called Indore. It's a thriving city in India. It constantly wins the award for being the cleanest city in India. Everyone says Indore is this really bustling hub, and when I went there, it was bustling. There were lots of great cafes, lots of cinemas and shopping malls that were opening. But they were all opening to cater to the students who'd come to Indore from different parts of central India as students. And these coaching centers are the ones that are being set up to cater to essentially gaps in the public education system. Young Indians and their families take out huge loans or large sums of money to give out to these coaching centers in hopes of finding a good job or making it into a decent college. But in fact, these problems only get worse. And that's because these coaching centers are a band-aid on a bullet wound. There simply aren't enough good jobs or colleges for these kids to get into once they're done, and even then the quality of instruction isn't the best. At one coaching center of engineering students, I met the instructor over there. He was an engineering dropout, and this was the only job available. And so an engineering dropout was teaching kids how to get engineering degrees. Now, what does this mean on India's economy, for India's economy and employment prospects? Some of you may know that until 1991, India primarily had a socialist mode of governance and economic growth. And in 1991, the country had such little money or foreign exchange reserves that it could not afford to import oil. It actually had to airlift gold to pay for oil imports. And then the IMF and the World Bank essentially told India that you need to liberalize, you need to open up your economy. And in the following years, millions were elevated out of poverty. New sunrise industries were created in the services sector and information technology. New cities were built and a new middle class had been created. And that was a game changer, a life changer for hundreds of millions of families. But unfortunately, those reforms didn't go far enough. The 1991 reforms are not a finished product. Now, since I mentioned jobs, here's something that we need to know. India has a highly informal and unorganized economy where most workers work in unstable jobs, largely in agriculture. That means they don't get a paycheck every second Friday. They only work a few months every year, usually when the crop needs to be sowed and then harvested. For the remaining part of the year, they don't have an income. The country has a small manufacturing sector and then a services sector which generates a lot of revenue but employs only a tiny fraction of the workforce. Even before COVID-19, the economy had begun to slow down after numerous years of so-called jobless growth, where the economy was growing fundamentally, but jobs were not. So in 2019, the Washington Post had reported a story where 19 million people had applied for 63,000 jobs in the country's railways when they had opened. And these were not high-paying or senior level jobs. These were the very entry level, the most entry level positions available, which the work responsibilities often entail bringing someone tea or riding a bicycle to deliver messages across town. 19 million people had applied. Then the Mumbai Mirror a few weeks later reported that when 1,100 constable positions, or the junior most position in the Mumbai police force, had opened up, more than 200,000 people applied. These included 3 doctors, 5 lawyers, 167 MBAs, and 423 engineers. The minimum qualification required for this job was completing higher secondary schooling, or the 12th standard, which is senior year in high school over here. Later, the Economic Times reported how 93,000 people, including 3,700 PhD holders and 28,000 postgraduates, applied for 62 government messenger positions in India's most populated state called Uttar Pradesh. The messenger position required a minimum education of class 5 and the hard-to-find skill of riding a bicycle. Why is that? Why is this happening in India, one of the world's largest economies and the world's second most populated country? Just some more figures before, not to bore you guys, but just before I get to some more findings. But one of the most surprising insights I found while researching my book was this desire and almost obsession with securing a government job. And here are some more numbers. 65% of Indian youth say that a government job is their #1 priority. The number two priority or the number one priority for the next group of people is becoming an entrepreneur, and that's 19%. But this isn't entrepreneurship in the sense of creating a startup or dropping out of college to start Facebook. It's entrepreneurship in the sense of maybe selling food by a roadside market or opening a juice stall, followed by only 7% of young Indians who said they wanted to work in the private sector. The survey also revealed that 7 in 10 respondents were anxious, and approximately 5 in 10 were highly so about jobs and employment. Now, why is that? Why do these numbers look the way they do? And that's because government jobs are stable. They're jobs you have for life. In an economy defined largely by informal employment, any chance to secure a stable job that pays you a stable paycheck and then gives you a pension is an opportunity that must be pursued. I want to share the story of someone I met. His story is in my book. He's a factory worker in the state of Rajasthan, a few hours away from Delhi, the capital of India. And he'd worked at this factory for 8 years, and he asked his supervisor, "Hey, I'm getting married, can I get some time off?" Now, he was a contract worker, so he essentially he was not a salaried employee of this business. The manager told him, "Sure, if you want to take some time off, you can do it, but when you come back, you're going to start off at the level you joined at 8 years ago." So essentially, his 8 years of work history had been wiped out, and he would have to restart at the entry-level position with nothing to show for it. Now, this is not something that most people within India or outside it think about when they consider the economy or investment opportunities in the country. But this is a reality that is playing out all across India, with job riots becoming increasingly common. Just last month, thousands of youth had set public property on fire in retaliation to alleged biases in the entrance examination for railway jobs. These are signs of simmering discontent, and it's about time that we took notice. 10 years ago, India's youth was called its greatest asset. It was believed that the millions of working-age young Indians would be the country's so-called demographic dividend, that when employed in stable jobs, they would consume goods and services, put that money back into the economy, and really become the nation builders of a middle-income and high-income India. But that actually has not played out. In many Indian states, politicians are now offering welfare programs aimed at the youth, when in most other countries, it's the youth that are financing welfare programs for older generations. Now, you think that when such discontent is taking place, when there's so much economic hardship, young people would actually punish those responsible for these conditions. Or they'd at least vote for those who are promising better jobs or have in previous times delivered better jobs. Now, pardon my self-indulgence, I included the picture of an op-ed that I wrote myself, but I described this issue in this space where I had essentially spent a few weeks on the campaign trail in India's general elections talking to young voters. And one of the most interesting things that I found is that I met people, people my age and older than me, who had been unemployed for many years and were in significant economic hardship, but they were not holding the incumbent responsible. They were not holding who many attribute the cause of these crises responsible for their hardship. In 2014, Narendra Modi, whose mask you can see over there, became the Prime Minister of India. He promised the country hundreds of millions of new jobs, bullet trains, and world-class infrastructure. And his party, the Hindu nationalist BJP, won an absolute majority in parliament on their own. This is not something that happens often in India. Their strength at the federal level implied that they could push through their agenda and fulfill some, or if not all, of the promises that they had made. Yet when I started researching my book, not only had these promises not been delivered, but things had actually gotten a whole lot worse for people in 2018. The cost of living had increased. New jobs hadn't been created, and because of ill-advised economic policies, like one decision on November 8, 2016, when the Prime Minister went on television and declared 86% of the country's currency that it would no longer be legal tender, employment had actually contracted since his party took office. Yet, as I said, a majority of those who I was interviewing and meeting, including unemployed people, were planning to enthusiastically re-elect the Prime Minister. In many other countries, this would seem a little puzzling, given that usually voters punish those who've caused them pain. But in India, economic outcomes have not always been the focus of voters. Politicians, most of whom are career politicians who cater to specific caste or religious groups, have never been expected to create jobs, and hence the lack of jobs is not something that a politician can be held responsible for. Instead, young Indians were impressed by the fiery rhetoric that Modi had adopted, buying into his claims that he was the only person capable of protecting India, and that questioning his policies made you an anti-national. It made you a traitor and not patriotic. It also helped that the opposition, which was reduced to its lowest strength since 2014, was nowhere to be found or seen. Now, this is not to say that progress had not been made in India. Millions now had access to electricity, sanitation, and welfare programs were being more efficiently delivered to many people across the country. But a lot of what was promised in 2014 had not been delivered. And instead, ruling party officials were complicit in often horrific cases of assaults on India's minorities. From the previously what was considered the untouchable Dalit community to lynchings of Muslim men who were allegedly involved in the beef trade. Things had become a whole lot worse in 2014, but the political conditions were not reflecting the economic realities that were taking place. Now, to switch gears a little bit, has anyone over here seen or heard of Indian matchmaking? Can we have a show of hands? Okay, so almost everyone, but for the uninitiated, Indian Matchmaking is a show on Netflix where a highly entertaining middle-aged woman named Seema Auntie, she's a matchmaker in Bombay. She basically travels all over the world, meeting young Indians who are trying to get married, and she talks to them. She collects this, detailed information on their lives. She's asking them questions about their careers, their incomes, what they're looking for, their desires, their family backgrounds, and she puts all of this information into what she calls a biodata, and then she goes back and finds matches based on this. Now, in reality, matchmaking in India is a whole lot is not that different. In that many of these considerations, with the most important one being caste, are still very important in the matrimonial process. Now, I have to share a story with you guys about an incident that I had on the Delhi subway. We call it the Delhi Metro. I was traveling across town, and it was midday, so there were quite a few seats open. I took a seat next to a middle-aged man. And I know it's very rude to look at someone's phone, to glance over at their screen, but I did it anyway because there was something really interesting going on. And what was interesting is that there was this middle-aged man midday, mid-afternoon on the Delhi Metro, and he was going through his phone, and it looked like it was a dating app, and many of the profiles, or all of the profiles, were of young men. And the reason why I found that interesting is because homosexuality is still considered taboo in India. So it's very rare for someone to be opening, of the same sex, to be opening a dating app in the middle of the Delhi subway. But what I actually discovered is that he was not looking at men for himself. He was looking at men for his daughter. And he had this pre-saved message that, hello, I am XYZ's father. My daughter has these qualifications. And she is of this caste group. And if you're interested, please, reply to this message. Now, if you look at this picture over here, this is the website of Shadi.com, which is India's biggest matrimonial website. In many ways, it's like Tinder and Match.com and all of that into one. And what I did for you guys is this is the landing page where you can create a profile. And if you look at the options, you can create a profile for yourself, your son, your daughter, your brother, your sister, your friend, or your relative. And while I was writing the book, I actually did that. I didn't go all the way, but I went through quite a few steps, and the questions were incredibly detailed. I said I'm creating a profile for myself. Then it asked me all these detailed questions about my skin color, about my height, about my weight, about my caste, about my subcaste, about my sub-subcaste, about my religion, whether I'm vegetarian or non-vegetarian. If I'm vegetarian, do I eat egg? Do I have garlic? Do I have ginger? Extremely detailed questions. And that's because for a lot of people, these things continue to matter. Here's a number. 84% of married millennials in India have had arranged marriages. And of those, 96% have been with people within their same caste and religious groups. Moreover, the median age at marriage is 19 years for women and 21 for men. That means if we were having this event in India, many in the audience would actually be married. Many people I speak to find these numbers surprising. And if you watch Bollywood movies, you'd be inclined to believe a completely different reality. You would believe that young Indians are busy, chasing romances across countries, singing and dancing and fighting a patriarchal and paternal system, and taking on all of this adversity. But in reality, most millennials are actually sticking with the centuries-old tradition of arranged marriages. And in my interviews, I was almost struck by how many people were so keen on an arranged marriage. Maybe 9 in 10 of my respondents said that they had already had an arranged marriage or that they were going to have one. And these were people from every socioeconomic background: rich, middle class, and lower income, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Sikh, and male and female. And that's when I began to dig deeper. What I found is that this desire, this obsession with arranged marriage is more about economics than anything else. Now think about this for a second. I had told you guys a little bit about the lack of jobs and economic opportunity in India. So what that means is for a lot of people, whether you're 20, 25, 30, or 35, the lack of high incomes means that you're living at home with your parents or your extended families. Now they decide it's time for you to get married, and they say, well, this is the boy or the girl you're going to marry. In some situations, you get a little bit of leverage. You can say, hey, maybe not this person, can you show me a few other matches? They might go along with it. In some stricter setups, they might not. But after a while, you have to acquiesce to their demands. What happens if you don't? At the very least, you risk straining your relationship with your family. One step further, your family can threaten to evict you from their home. That means you're homeless now. A few steps further, they can threaten you with violence. They can say that if you don't follow our will, we'll do something. And many steps further, they can kill you. And honor killings, continue to take place in India. In my book, I write about the honor killing of a Christian man in the South Indian state of Kerala in India. Kerala is a wealthy state. It has almost universal literacy, high incomes, and really great human development indices. But it still has many of the same trends that you're seeing in the rest of the country. In the incident that I share in my book, there were a man named Kevin who was from the Christian community, but he was a Dalit Christian. So the caste system applies even to Christianity in India. And he fell in love with an upper caste Christian girl. And what happened is that her parents were completely against it. And so her brother and some of his friends, they beat up Kevin and they killed him, and his body was found floating in a river a few days later. Kevin is one example of many countless stories that dominate or appear in India's newspapers quite often. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that, again, pardon my self-indulgence, but most millennials cannot actually afford to fall in love. Because if they do, and if they're in the wrong circumstance, they could, stand to lose a lot. Now, I know some of that was sobering and depressing, and not all of my research was that. One of the things I thought about a lot while writing my book was, what should the tone of my book be, and the tone of what I'm saying. And I realized I don't want to paint a rosier picture than reality, because that's not my job. My job is to share what I was seeing and is to write about the reality that I was experiencing. But I did find some really interesting silver linings that I'm most excited to talk about. And that's really the effect of social media and technology on the millennial existence. So as I said earlier, India has some of the cheapest mobile data in the world, and nearly 600 to 700 million Indians are smartphone users. The mobile data is really fast and reliable. And honestly, guys, I'm waiting for the time that some of these companies come to the US to give AT&T and Verizon competition, because it's really not fun to be on an individual plan, unlimited plan in the US. These people are part of an incredible technology revolution taking place in India, with profound impact on its economy, but also its society, equality, opportunity, and politics. And what that means is millions of young Indians in small towns, villages, and cities today have the same access to information and opportunities as anyone else in the United States, Europe, and you guys in this room. This has created a truly incredible democratization of information and access that was previously only limited to upper-class Indians in big cities. Now I'm going to share two stories with you guys. The first is of Nazneen. Both of these stories are in my book. The first is of Nazneen. Nazneen was 26 when she got married. She's from the Indian city of Hyderabad. She had an arranged marriage a few years after it was common for girls in her neighborhood and in her socioeconomic group. And she was at first very excited with the match and with the marriage, because her sister had sort of found this, this match, and he had a job in Qatar. He was an aircraft engineer. He was making good money. Nazneen would have the opportunity to travel abroad, to live outside India for a few years. And so she moved with him to Doha, where he was based. And at first, they had a decent marriage. Nazneen and him, they would go out for dinners. They wouldn't talk a whole lot. They didn't have much in common, but, they would go out. But then some things began to change. And what happened is, a few times, Nazneen, when her husband would come back home, he would smell a very strong perfume, a perfume called attar that predominantly women use. And after a while, Nazneen confronted her husband. She asked him, why do you smell of this? Are you having an affair? He denied it, and he assaulted her. He used to beat her up regularly. When he'd leave for work, he would lock the apartment and take the key with him. He also confiscated her passport. Somehow, Nazneen found a way to escape, and she went back to India, to her parents in Hyderabad. But she was also a few months pregnant at the time, and she had a rough pregnancy. She decided to live with her parents, and she was predominantly confined to her bed for most of her pregnancy. But one day, she was on the internet. She was on YouTube, and she saw this video that caught her eye. It was a makeup tutorial. Have folks in the audience seen makeup tutorials on YouTube? I, in fact, used a Thai tutorial before coming here because during COVID, I sort of fell out of practice for a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay. So Nazneen saw this makeup tutorial, and it was in Hindi, so it was in her language, and there was this Indian woman telling her how to apply makeup, in all of these different ways, and she was hooked. She was like, wow, this is so interesting. And she saw all the recommended videos, and she really went down the rabbit hole of YouTube's recommendations. And she's like, well, she probably saw hundreds of hours worth of YouTube makeup tutorials. And she began to practice. So first she practiced on herself, then she practiced on girls in her neighborhood. Now after having her child, Nazneen had a lot of time on her hands. And so she just started doing makeup on girls in her neighborhood informally. Then they told her, hey, Nazneen, you're really good at this. Why don't you start charging money? And, why don't you do bridal? And if you guys are a little familiar with some of the customs in India, Indian weddings are huge and they're really colorful. And bridal makeup is a very lucrative line of work. There's people who make thousands and thousands of dollars for just doing, 30 minutes of bridal makeup. And so she got into it. She started doing bridal makeup on girls in her neighborhood, and she would share these photos on Instagram and WhatsApp and Facebook. And initially, more and more people from different parts of town started to come to Nazneen. And she realized, well, now I don't have much, I have too many clients, let me hire someone to help me out. So she hired another woman in her parents' living room. Then she realized, well, why don't I move on to something else? Why don't I do hairstyling as well? Why don't I do eyebrow threading? And so where did she go to learn these techniques? She went onto YouTube, and she learned how to thread eyebrows on YouTube. And when I met Nazneen to write my book, she was opening her own beauty salon, employing 5 other women in Hyderabad. 20 years ago, Nazneen's story would not have been possible. That of a domestic abuse survivor and single mother from a conservative family, becoming an entrepreneur who used to take pocket money from her parents and is now giving money back to her parents. That story is a uniquely millennial story, empowered by technology and social media. WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook became her word of mouth, and YouTube became her teacher. The second story I'm going to share is of this gentleman right here. His name is Sumit Samos. Sumit Samos comes from India's Dalit community. The Dalit community has been previously considered to be untouchable, and while caste discrimination is illegal in India today, it continues to occur. Just for context, for those who don't know a whole lot about this community, as I mentioned, they're considered untouchable, and for centuries have faced the most brutal discrimination. In some villages, a few decades ago, they were only allowed to enter at night so that nobody saw them during the day. In other villages, they were told, ring a bell before you come so that the upper caste can turn away and they don't look at you. This community has traditionally been involved with the meat trade and the leather trade in India. When Sumit comes from a poor Indian state and a village in the state of Orissa, and when he came to Delhi, he came to a public university in Delhi, and he wanted to get involved in campus politics. He wanted to get involved in left-wing communist politics. But he found student groups were led by upper castes who basically just wanted him to stick posters on walls. They told him, hey, great, you want to be involved? Stick these posters on walls. But he wanted to do more. He started rapping. He's a great rapper. He started rapping and uploading some of his videos on YouTube. And in 2016, one of his videos went viral. The video is called Ladai Seekh Le, which means learn how to fight. Learn how to fight oppression. And that video went viral, and ever since it became viral, he became a sensation among his community. He became a youth activist and an organizer and a mobilizer. He got invited by college campuses and student groups within India, but also has performed in Paris and in Mauritius. When I met Sumit, I was invited on one of India's news channels to speak about some of the interviews I was doing, and it was a current affairs show. And Sumit had been invited to rap, and that's where I first met him in 2019. But I want to share a really interesting update on Sumit's life. A year and a half ago, Sumit applied to Oxford University. He applied for a master's program. He had a really interesting story to share, and Oxford accepted him. But hear this, he needed a scholarship and he didn't get one. He wanted a Rhodes Scholarship, he wanted some other scholarships, but those weren't available to him. So what did Sumit do? He went onto social media, he created a GoFundMe page, and raised the entire amount for his tuition, living expenses, and travel from strangers online. He raised nearly $80,000 from people who he had never met in real life to finance his education as a Dalit scholar at one of the most prestigious universities in England. Once again, Sumit's story would not have been possible 10, 15, or 20 years ago. Social media and the internet have provided women and minorities opportunities and places to interact when physical spaces have not been available to them in India. It's truly broken all barriers. It's shown people that I don't have to live within this local context. I can achieve whatever I want to achieve. I can dream however big I want to dream, and I can make it happen on the internet. And that's one of the most inspiring and exciting stories that I encountered while I was doing my research. Now, to take some of my self-indulgence forward, here are some photos that I sort of put together from some of my events that took place in India after my book came out. And the reason why I'm sharing these tonight is because I didn't write a book to write a book. I didn't write a book to feel good about myself. I wrote this book to get a conversation started about the future of India and about the future of its youth and how we can build that collective future together. I had some fun events. I had some very interesting magazine covers where a lot of makeup was put on my face by people who refused to listen to me protest. But ultimately, the greatest validation for me was getting messages and notes of recognition and appreciation from, once again, strangers who were completely outside of my networks of influence or communities that I belong to. I got many messages on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, of people who read my book and said that they found it interesting and that it challenged them to think about some of these issues in a new light and differently. And as an author, as a writer of this book, that's the greatest validation that I could have received, that it got one person to think differently. And I did include, a tweet from my editor about the sales of the book, because I never imagined that this would happen. I never imagined that there would be such an audience and such a desire to understand what was going on in India and to understand the youth of the country. And so I, ultimately, this is the end of my talk, and I'm really excited to get some questions from you guys about the insights I gathered, and I'm also going to be speaking at lunch tomorrow here at the Athenaeum, which is going to be more of a book-focused talk about the process of writing this book and how that came about. So if you're interested in a longer conversation on that, please do sign up for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivan. Such a special talk, and so special to be receiving it from such a recent alum of the college. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the evening. If you have a question, we ask that you stand behind one of these two microphones, and when you come up to the mic, we also ask that you introduce yourself, your name, your year, your major. I have a question. I can kick it off. It was great to have dinner with you, kind of learn about the process of doing all this research, but I'm also kind of interested in the craft of the book and your storytelling. How did you decide to focus on those particular sort of avenues of the millennial experience. Is there anything you wish you touched on that you didn't just have the time or the space to get around to?
Thank you. That's a great question. And that's sort of one of those hard realities that I woke up to after Claremont, because the previous big project that I had done was my senior thesis with Professor Sinha. And I got to see her every week, and we would go over drafts, we would go over my ideas, and I constantly got feedback on what was working, what was academically, what was a good argument to make, what are some things I should pursue. But on this book, I was entirely on my own. My publisher was, of course, involved in publishing the book, but it was entirely me who was deciding which stories to include, which to leave out, what themes to cover. And ultimately, what I realized is that the book, for those who have not read it, is written entirely in the first person. And it's written in a very conversational style that, hey, I found this surprising, I found this interesting, and that's why maybe you will as well. So I identified my readers really being anyone interested in economics or business or politics or just, India in general. And I wrote it to that reader that, while traveling, I found this interesting. The second part of your question about what I wish I could have done differently, I wish I could have, I think one of the blind spots of the book is that by virtue of being a young man traveling in a relatively conservative country, I was not able to talk to as many women as I would have liked to. And I think the book would have benefited from more perspectives from women. I think it would have also benefited from some more. I often get questions about, my book is entirely, when I talk about marriage, I talk entirely about heterosexual relationships. So it would have been interesting to actually find out about same-sex relationships and things like that. Even when I talk about conservatism, I often talk about conservatism among Hindus, but I don't talk about conservatism among India's many minority religions. So I do wish I could have done some of that, but I also, ultimately you have to decide what you're going to include in 300 pages, and it was a tough call.
Hello. Okay, I'm gonna be on my tiptoes. Thank you first for this talk. I bet for most of, thank you. Okay, that's better. I bet for most of the brown kids in the audience, this is very empowering to hear. But so at the head table, we kind of talked a little about how you yourself come from a place of privilege growing up in India. And so while you went through this 18-month-long process of like coming to terms with like whatever you were learning, how personally, like, what did that mean for you personally, whether it was like difficult conversations with family or just like reconciling your reality with others' realities as like the target audience for your research too?
Exactly, and that's a great question, because I did come from a place where I had not actually lived the lives of many of the people I was writing about. But I was very clear that this book is not about me. This book is not about my opinion or what I think. It's about the people I was meeting. But you did touch upon the blind spots, right? Like, what blind spots did I have? And like I sort of said earlier, as someone who is an upper caste, upper class Indian, in many ways, I was not fully able to empathize with people who have had, extremely different sort of or hard upbringings. And I think every author faces that, especially when you're writing a book of anthropology that's based on interviews. Every author comes at it with their own sort of blind spots. So that was one of mine, definitely.
Hi, I'm Sambhav. I'm a freshman, undecided for now. Loved your talk. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on, how social media, do you think the benefits outweigh the disadvantages? You see a lot of misinformation, a lot of, this Hindu nationalist propaganda it's being floated around through social media. A lot of bad things happening on social media, especially in India among millennials. So what are your thoughts? What your outlook looking forward, and what you think about social media and how it's not as good as it seems?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd actually asked someone at the table. I said, if it doesn't come up, someone should ask me this. But and that's something I thought about a lot. So actually, the first chapter of my book opens with the example of someone who has fallen prey to social media misinformation. And he is someone who comes, from Bihar actually, no, a different state, but had, very radical views because of the information and the content that he was getting on WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram. And one of the things when you have so many new smartphone users, so many new internet users, is that people often will subscribe to a Facebook page and they will assume that that is the news. But many of these Facebook pages are dominated by political parties or cultural organizations, and people don't actually know the difference between the content that they are putting out and that a news organization might put out. So misinformation is very rife on social media, and it is creating a lot of challenges. I've also talked, in the book I talk about an incident where someone got lynched because they were allegedly accused of being a part of a human trafficking ring. And that rumor went viral on WhatsApp, and some people had killed 1 or 2 men because they were accused of being a part of a human trafficking ring. But what I ultimately found is that yes, that radicalism exists, but it exists among a small, yet very vocal and powerful and angry minority. But the bigger majority is one that is actually using the internet and social media and people like Sumit and Nazneen to really, improve their lives and to really access opportunities that were never available to them or people like them previously. And so, yes, like there are, it's not black or white, and there are definitely many disadvantages, but I did find that the advantages outweighed the setbacks.
Right, thanks. Hello, my name is Will Ellsworth. I'm a CMC student studying psychology and public policy. And you kind of answered the question, but I wanted to still offer it to you, which is, you talked about how to question the majority for a lot of Indian millennials was to not be patriotic. And then you also showed us, some really stark statistics that came out of major news, news organizations. And so I'm kind of wondering, what's the nature of political discourse among millennials on social media, and why is it still such a common feeling that if you to fight the majority is non-patriotic?
Unfortunately, the level of discourse has really coarsened, and particularly on social media, and it's much easier to say hateful things to a stranger on the internet than it is to someone in real life. And can you restate the second part of your question?
I'm just wondering why, why the idea that being that fighting the majority is unpatriotic is continuing even with this increased access to social media. In your view,
can you say that again?
In your view, why has more people are using social media? How is and there's an increase in access to information.
Yeah.
So why are people still viewing it as unpatriotic to fight some of the systems that are causing these issues to occur?
Because what's essentially happened is that the social media ecosystem was early on adopted and dominated by the Hindu nationalist right wing, and they have a really impressive social media operation. They can churn out amazing memes, right after that content has been created. And what the ecosystem really, it's become an echo chamber. And in that echo chamber, what really happens is that if you support us, you are pro-India, and you're pro-Hindu, and you are a patriot. And if you don't support us electorally, or if you believe the opposition might have good ideas, you are an anti-national. Now, this goes into what you were, the first part of your question, in that a lot of people actually do not know that the information that they are getting is that from a Facebook page, and is not actually, written by a journalist or someone who's actually reporting on facts. It's written by someone sitting somewhere being paid to create content, as opposed to, reporting a story. So in this vacuum of good information, people really don't know, what to believe. So they believe what they're inclined to want to believe. And that usually means that, if you are from a particular caste group or religious group, you will support the politicians who make explicit appeals to your identity, because they're talking about your identity and how they're going to protect you and make sure your group does well, maybe at the expense of others.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm a freshman at CMC. So you talked about a lot of the problematic aspects of like how the environment the millennials grew up in. So I'm wondering, what do you think the society and the government could do more, and what can they improve in order to prevent these problematic issues to recur for the next generation?
So I think ultimately a lot of this, which you're seeing in many other countries, boils down to the fact that um, people don't have jobs, they don't have stable incomes, and in such an environment, they want to blame their problems on someone. And in many of the people I met who were sort of not up to the best deeds in society, they were only able to they were only able to cause trouble because they had the time to do so. But if you're working somewhere, you might have whatever attitudes you do, but they're just on social media. They rarely actually, you're rarely allowed to actually act on them in real life. But a lot of people who are sort of, at the forefront of some of these, these incidents and activities are those who don't have jobs. So I think the best solution right now is to create that kind of, mass scale employment. Of course, it's much easier for me to say, standing here in Claremont than to actually do it on the ground. These things take a lot of time and, really sensible policy making and all of that. But I think that is ultimately what's going to, be the solution, and also a good education system. But in many ways, the politicians in India are not prioritizing the education system because the current system is working so well for them. So if we can keep people, where they are and keep them voting for us, then why should we change it?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Vivan. My name is Devanshi. I'm a first year at CMC. You mentioned that Indians, like the millennial generation of India, cannot afford to fall in love. So my question to you is that given that the millennials themselves are getting married and having children, wouldn't they prevent the same narrative from occurring to their children and their offspring? Which leads me to the next question, building upon that premise, that why should we care about the Indian millennials when the next biggest generation, Gen Z, will not be suffering likely from the same issues because the parents will prevent that?
Okay, that's a great question, and I can't necessarily say that I've thought about it. Because you're right, a lot of millennials, including the ones who I met, are already parents, but they're parents of young kids. So maybe, in our conversations, it didn't get that far. But ultimately, at the end of the day, these issues are so woven into identity that, we have to protect our caste group. We have to keep our caste endogamy. We have to keep our, religious endogamy. We have to keep our last name. And I'm not necessarily so sure that this will go away with income or with time, because these are much deeper emotional issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kyra, and I'm a freshman at CMC as well. And I just had a question regarding the whole talk about technology, and agreed that it has a lot of impacts in India, but India is also a country with one of the biggest digital divides that we have. So I was just wondering, what are your opinions on that and the idea that although technology and social media has created such an impact, there's also such a huge divide in terms of access to that, which I think you did mention, of course, but would you be able to elaborate a bit more on that?
No, that's a great question. And to talk a little bit more about the digital divide, it's primarily women who actually lose out on the digital divide, because in a family, if there's a smartphone, it's usually the husband or the father or the boy or the son who gets to use it. Even in married couples, it's the husband who has a smartphone, and then the wife does not, always get to use it. So, in my sort of my daily job in user research, we often think about this, like, how do you build products for women when women are not actually the owners of those smartphones? And I think this is a really big problem that, we need to think about, but it is sort of decreasing with time. Tomorrow, you can go in India and you can buy a smartphone for $40. Less than that, a really good smartphone. And you can get a mobile data plan for $3 a month, $4 a month. And so I think as incomes increase and people begin to realize, like, I cannot actually do anything without a smartphone. I can't get, I can't do a financial transaction, get my welfare payment, contact people. The digital divide is already decreasing and is going to continue to decrease. So I think just with time, it's one of those things that will go away. But that's a great question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Vivan. I have one question from Zoom to close off the night. So this is from Terry Gibbs, class of 73 from CMC. Direct quote, which I support. You are so articulate, concise, poignant, and knowledgeable. Everyone should hear you speak. Will you run for prime minister, or what will your future be?
Thank you. I really don't know, but that's too early to ask me right now. But I do intend to speak more about this. And Terry, please get a copy of the book and let me know what you think once you're done reading it as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, please join me in thanking Vivan Marwaha for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.